Like from the perspective you prayed to God, or was there never a time you were into prayer and these things?
Not really.
Because Moses and his people were in the Exodus.
You know,
Told by God,
we
this is now your promised land.
you know, I got
Moses could
like
not
most
enter it
people, because religion spread through families. That's the predominant
So they had the same
sort of
70
vehicle
years till that
in which
that rebellious generation
religious
died,
doctrines
so
have
much so that Moses
sort of
could not even
spread
enter Jerusalem.
through childhood and then through. That's reinforced through family links and community links and
Then they went
societal links.
Isn't that true of any belief that it's spread through family, whether it's atheism or Islam or Christianity?
No, my family, you know, I come from an African family, heavily religious, unfortunately. Christianized, you know, a couple of members of Islam as well.
And then,
You know, so these are the effects of colonialism, imperialism. These are the effects of.
But I'm sure religion existed amongst the African people before colonization and imperialism.
Absolutely.
Like Christianity in Ethiopia has been there.
No, I'm not even talking about Christianity. I mean, Christianity is a relatively new religion. It's not, you know, it's not that old actually. To be fair, it's been around for, you know, arguably in its present form for about sort of 1,500 years. Really, it's not a you know, in 1,800 years. You know. Islam even less. You know, so these are not new phenomena. You know, Africans, you know. Sub-Saharan Africans, West Africans have had their own traditions, had their own spiritual beliefs and religions, and, you know, so these got subsumed, as I say, with, you know, colonialism and invasion.
Well, the thing about colonization is that you could argue, but the same applies for atheism, because what atheists did is that when they had power, they forcibly converted people to disbelief. The communists did this in China, the Soviets did this, the communists in Europe did this, and you know, before we got into this topic, you spoke about bloodshed, you spoke about the toxic effects of religion. Well, atheism's no better, because more people have died under atheist rule than have died in all of the religious wars.
It's impossible.
So I'll give you a stat. 100 million people at least died under communist regimes in the last 100 years. And 100 million people have not died in religious wars throughout human history.
Yes, they have. More, actually.
How?
Far more.
How?
Well, you've got to take the First and Second World War, started by, you know, Christians and religious advocates.
Are you saying they were religious wars?
Well, they weren't religious wars per se, but they were committed and instigated by religious people.
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, Hitler was not a Christian.
Absolutely, he was a Christian. He was a kind of warped, sort of, kind of sectarian, Protestant mishmash of occultism and Christianity, but it was definitely a Christian. He was definitely believed in God. He wasn't an atheist or some sort of pantheist. He was a God believer.
So let's look at the instigators.
Let's carry on with the numbers, because your numbers are, I mean, from my perspective, completely spurious. So we've got religious countries starting the First and Second World War, mass killing, mass murder on a grand scale. Then you've got, prior to that, mass colonialism, millions, millions across Africa, across Asia, exploited and, used by, you know, religious instigators.
So you've gone to colonization, but let's stick to the First and Second World War.
Yes.
You're saying these were religious wars?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they were instigated by countries that subscribe to a belief in a deity and a god.
Okay,
and they claim that, and on different levels, they would claim that they had a mandate from their god to do what they did.
That's not the history of the first two world wars.
No.
That had nothing to do with it.
Well, you have to look at the people and the institutions that instigated these wars and the foundations on which they
were territorial wars.
derive their power.
No, they were territorial wars. They
Of-
were not.
of-
They were,
of- of course
they were
they
not
were.
wars because of
course
religion.
Of course they were. No. But they were religious, God-believing advocates. That was the foundation of
No,
their.
not really.
Yes,
I mean,
they are.
okay, but look,
Yes, they were.
let's go back to the stat that I started off with, and let's just stick on, say, one person.
And what? And what was it?
Chairman Mao killed
hold on,
80 million people.
Well,
First and Second World War, 80 million people did not die.
Hold on. Well, we'll come back to that because I want to know where you got those statistics from. Actually,
These are well established.
No. We'll come back to that. I'm not
So
going to let you just
the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward,
okay.
the conservative
Okay,
estimates are going
okay.
to tens of millions.
No.
This is well known.
No. If you're talking about the Cultural Revolution during the 60s, from the late 50s that ran out onto sort of the mid 70s, a lot of people died.
How many do you think?
Around sort of 10 to 20 million.
Okay,
Right.
I think it's more than that, but let's stick to 10 to 20 million.
10 to 20 million.
And he was an
Right?
atheist, Chairman Mao?
He was an atheist, yes.
Yeah,
He
so
was.
your initial point that religions are the cause of violence,
No.
you can see
No,
here
no,
that
no.
an atheist is
No,
killing
that-
millions of his own people.
No. That wasn't. They're not just the cause of violence. My contention to you was that they promote a lack of critical thinking, non-thinking, a lack of skepticism, and this kind of mass credulity, basically.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Why didn't the atheists come up with the scientific method, if that's the case? Why was it that the science was advanced by theists until recently?
Well, science is a methodology.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's the people. Most of the people. Well, if you're talking about Europeans, the early Europeans in the early part of the what they would call the scientific Enlightenment were religious. Yeah, I mean, I think they were religious in a cultural sense.
But that's not the genesis of science.
No, it's not the genesis of
That's
science.
late. That's late.
No. The genesis of science is the need to survive in our environment. That's the genesis of science. It's not. It's not inspired by some sort of magic entity. It's the need to advance and survive in our environment. That is by and large hostile to us. So we've needed to find ways to navigate and conquer and survive in environments that would otherwise kill us. So,
that's not the definition of science, though.
Well, that's definitely one of the definitions.
No,
of
it's
science.
not.
Science is the process of finding practical, empirical, real-time solutions to real problems, real physical problems. Right?
That's a bit too vague. Let's define science first, because what I'm trying to get to is that the scientific torch was not held by atheists. It was held by theists for a long time in history. So first we need to define science. So science is the application of reason to the natural world, in which you use observations to come up with theories, and you test those theories against observations. You try and falsify it until you have a confirmed set of beliefs. You have a confirmed set of things that you can put together in a broader theory. So this basic idea is not something which was put forward by atheists. This is something which only in the 20th century and the 21st century have atheists woken up and said, actually, we are quite a scientifically literate people. Prior to this, it was the Muslims, and then it was the Christians, and atheists came late at the party, but they want to claim they're behind this.
Atheists have been there's been atheists since.
In just about 10 minutes. Sure.
Atheists have been, around since the emergence and the progression of man.
But they haven't produced much, though.
Yes, we have.
Science, we agree, was a theistic venture.
No, it's not. No. It's a human. It's a human.
And those humans happen to be theists.
Well, if you're talking about ancient agrarian religions of all types, not just.
I'm actually talking about the genesis of science, which goes back to theists. It doesn't go back to atheists.
you could probably get away with your definition of science from a philosophical point of view, right? In a strictest term, but I'm talking about science in a pragmatic way, in the real sense of the word, in the real sense of the process, which is solving, which is finding ways and finding solutions to solve real problems in the real world. Right? That's how science progresses. It's not some sort of ethereal concept. Science is purely materialistic, right? And it deals with real material problems, right? So, whether it doesn't matter what belief systems people in South America had, that created all sorts of scientific innovations that believed in completely different gods, or North America, that again had all sorts of scientific innovations in order to allow them to survive in their environment, had their own type of gods. The type of science that you found in Africa, that allowed the people to thrive in their environment. Science is the application of finding solutions and finding mechanisms for us to survive and thrive in any given environment. It's not a sort of a philosophical sort of bubble that people have subscribed to. And theists negate the fact that try and bypass the fact that it's humans that find those solutions. Don't rely on magic, invisible entities to bestow us with solutions. We find those solutions through trial and error, through testing, through observation, through experience. And
I'm not following your logic here, because I didn't make the argument that you need to believe in God in order to do science. I never said that.
Well, okay, so now you seem to be eating your words.
What do you
seem
mean?
to be eating your words.
No.
Yes.
I made the argument that the genesis of science and the torchbearers of science throughout history were theists.
No.
That's just a fact. No. So, well, you can disagree with it, but your feelings don't affect facts. The facts stay as facts.
And Islam, being one of the sort of newer religions, had very, very little to do with science.
That's absolutely not true.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll give you an example. I'll give you evidence, because you're speaking from your experience, but I'm going to give you evidence. Okay. So Hassan ibn Haytham, he was a Muslim theologian and a scientist. He lived about 1,000 years ago, and he is the one who helped us modernize the scientific method. So if you go look up the history of science, you will see he is mentioned as somebody who developed not just scientific ideas, but the scientific method itself. And this goes back way before Galileo, Newton and Bacon and all of these guys. So the history of science and the infusion of philosophical concepts to help enhance science was done by Muslims for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And for you to downplay their contribution just simply shows your lack of knowledge of this historical era.
No. It's clear to me that the tradition of the people that now call themselves Muslims and the initiators that adopted those Abrahamic beliefs or those Abrahamic stories clearly were, massively influenced by the Persians and the Egyptians and the Greeks. I mean, you can see it in.
That's neither here nor there. What does that mean?
Well, but that means that
because they were theists too.
Well, of course they were, but unfortunately, the world and time and humanity doesn't start with Muslims, Christians, Jews, the Greeks, Persians, or people from the Middle East. Science itself, the process of science, transcends all of those cultures, and it is the ongoing, evolution of humanity itself. You can argue about following certain traits and traditions, that certain scientific methods and methodologies were codified, which is true. Largely the West was inspired and gained
by the Muslim world.
No, not just the Muslim world. I don't know why you.
Do you know the history of the Renaissance?
Well,
Do you know the history?
Which one?
The Renaissance that happened in the 16th century. The Renaissance in terms of how the Islamic world impacted the Western world.
It did. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I'm not arguing about that. There's been a trajectory.
Actually, even before that, 16th, I said 12th, 13th, 14th century.
But you can go to the Ming Dynasty. You can go to the
But again,
Chinese.
none of these are atheists. What you're describing, none of them.
Well,
Atheists have contributed almost nothing until recently.
Sorry, you're trying to define the process in which we use to survive in our environment, which is a scientific, pragmatist methodology.
But that's not the definition of science, though.
Well, it's okay. You can.
That's just the application of reason.
No. You can try and couch it in a kind of philosophical framework of strict definitions, but I'm looking at this. I look at things from a Marxist scientific perspective. So,
what's a Marxist scientific perspective?
Well, we look at
Marx
things,
was not a scientist.
No, but my philosophical and political views are couched in the pragmatism of applying Marxist values.
What would Marx think of you as a black person? Do you know what Marx thought about black people?
What did he think about black people?
He was a very racist individual.
No, he was not.
He was. No, he was. Have you looked
not.
up what he said about black people?
What did he say about black people?
Just Google it. I'm not going to repeat it here.
No. I've got fixed.
A lot of people back then were racist, including him, and they wrote some quite nasty things.
So what specifically did he say?
Well, you'll have to Google it.
No.
You'll have to Google it.
You've put yourself on the line here.
Yeah, I have.
So what did Marx say about black people?
Well, he said some pretty nasty things. That's what I know. Well, you have to Google it.
What did he say? In what context? Where was it? What did he say about black people?
When did he say? Wait, hang on. For me not to quote to you verbatim what he said is meaningless. Now, you can go and establish yourself what he actually said. Marx, just like Darwin, just like all these other guys, they were quite racist towards black people.
Well,
so for you to look, you're making a few mistakes here. You described yourself as someone couched in the tradition of Marxist science, when Marx had absolutely nothing to say about science. Marx was actually a failed predictor in terms of human sociological events, and he was not only a failure from that perspective, he was somebody who we can see repeatedly throughout his followers, who today try to
he inspired the most successful nations to emerge in the 20th century.
Which nations?
Russia and China. And
you can't be serious.
I'm very serious.
You cannot be serious.
China is the number 2.
Soviet Union was successful.
Absolutely.
They killed millions of their own people.
Listen.
Chairman Mao killed millions of his own people.
Okay. So
how is that success?
Well, he also saved and lifted up far more people than were killed, and we can discuss.
How?
And we can discuss how those people were killed and why they were killed in the context of a civil war, in the context of.
We're not talking about civil war here.
No, we are talking about civil war.
No, we're not. When Stalin did the purges and Mao did the purges, that's not civil war.
We're talking about one transformation from one system to another. We're talking about resistance. We're talking about civil strife within the context of.
That's not what the Cultural Revolution was. That's not what the Great Leap Forward was.
Sorry. You're talking about the Chinese. Now you're bringing in the Chinese.
Well, you mentioned them as successful.
I am, but let's separate them out. Right? I'm talking about, and I'm not denying that millions of people were killed, but far more people were liberated and lifted up.
And they had a terrible economic system.
Both.
They were starving nations.
No, I'm sorry.
And China's successful today because of capitalism.
Let's look at the record. No, let's look at the record. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was the sick man of the Euro sort of Asiatic sphere.
I don't disagree with that.
People were. It was largely majority in the agrarian society. People were wearing bark shoes. You know, it was under rule of a kind of despot monarchy. You know, like as most of Europe were, that eventually dragged everybody into this First World War. But you know, it was a terribly backward, you know, completely underdeveloped, you know, agrarian society, right? Where very, very few people, apart from, you know, the sort of the, you know, the upper echelons and the, you know, the royalty and their small circle, that were all linked to other European.
Yeah, I'm
families.
aware of the Russian histories from that perspective. But I'm interested in seeing how you're going to think communism made it better.
Well, okay.
Marxism make it better.
Absolutely. But so then you had the revolution in 1917, the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks came to power.
Yeah.
And of course the pseudo proletariat dragged the working class and you know, helped butcher millions of people in the process throughout that war on behalf of colonialist, imperialist and royalists against you know, what the Bolsheviks wanted to do. But anyway, when the Bolsheviks came to power, they completely lifted up and brought all of the what you would call the proletariat opportunity through education, through collective cultivation, through mass building programs, through mass industrialization, through massive education, to the point where when the West and most of the so-called developed world were starving and you know, in dire straits in the 1920s and early 30s, the Soviet Union was thriving up to the point where, you know, they became, up to this day, which is why everybody's having, you know, massive issues. I'm not saying that Russia is now strictly a communist country or a Soviet country, but the legacy and the structures of those, the Soviets and the Soviet Union left behind, bore fruit for what we now know as Russia, being completely self-contained, being the breadbasket of the a third of the breadbasket of the world, right? They educated up to, you know, 99.9% of the population, where illiteracy was a huge problem at the beginning of the 20th century. They pioneered space travel. They, you know, lifted themselves up to be the one of the two major superpowers militarily on this planet, from being completely exposed and, you know, relentlessly under attack by all sorts of powers at the beginning of the 20th century, to, you know, to being a power that essentially held the balance of power up until, you know, the early 90s, when they had this horrific concession with, you know, the wall falling down. But they're back to where they should be now. But from where they started in the late 19th and early 20th century to where they eventually were, even if you count the catastrophe in the early 90s, you know, the growth and the power of that country, of lifting the amount of people they lifted out of poverty, industrializing the scientific innovations, space travel, you know, security of the population, you know, up until they adopted.
Okay, so no, I get everything you've said.
That's Russia.
But
let's go on to China. China's even more profound.
No, okay, one second. Everything you just said there about Russia,
yes,
it can be explained
yes,
without the need to invoke the communists and what they actually did, because Russia has a huge.
It would never have done. It would have never have happened.
Russia has a huge amount of resources, and now America at the same time became far more advanced under capitalism.
No,
then
absolutely not.
Russia did.
Who put the first people up in space? Who put the first people up in space?
That doesn't exonerate them from the huge economic problems they had. It doesn't exonerate them from the millions of people that starved. And remember, the Soviet Union collapsed because of what? Their terrible economic model.
No.
So there was only in the supermarkets vinegar, salt.
No.
Speak to people that were living under Soviet Union. Why was a huge queue for McDonald's once the Soviet Union collapsed? Because capitalism. Look, I'm not in favor of capitalism. I'm just saying that your view of Marxism, and I was googling some of the racist stuff about Marx, and I want to show you some of that stuff as well.
Yes.
I think you're totally out of date with Marx's not only religion, not only views of black people, but also his terrible economic description and sociological description. Because you're about to go into China. China before. During the time of Mao Zedong, when it was communist, it was poor. When they applied capitalism, that's when they became rich. So China today is a capitalistic economy.
It's not a capitalist economy.
Of course it is.
No, it's not. So let me help you define what a capitalist economy is. Capitalists run the economy for the primacy of profit.
And what's the Chinese Communist Party doing?
No, hold on. So profit is at the pinnacle, is at the helm of their motivation for running, any system. So, as far as the capitalist is concerned, the main objective, their main priority is for a corporation or a company or a conglomerate.
No, I'm fully aware of these distinctions.
Hold
what I want to know is what makes you think China is a communist state?
I'll come to that. Economically speaking. So that is the primary motive.
No, I get it. I get what you're saying.
Of any capitalist country, right? It's the
primacy of profit.
Primacy of profit above all.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, if you read Marx, you know that, or Engels, you know that the motivation, because communism and Marxism is about the proletariat or the man in the street having primacy, having control over the means of production. For the benefit and the greater good of society as a whole. Capitalists run the economy.
Look, I'm fully aware of this.
No.
And do you know China took land and they did collective farming and millions of people died?
Hold on.
Do you know about this?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
So that's when they applied a Marxist model, and they redistributed the land. They had collective farming, and millions of people starved. This is well established.
No. So
you're just denying history.
No, I'm not denying history. There was definitely mistakes made during
which cost millions of lives.
Yes, it did. Not as many lives as the Western or the capitalists.
By the way, Chinese scholars have spoken about huge numbers, not just the West.
Well, I think somewhere between 10 to 20 million is a huge number.
10 to 20, we're talking more like 100 million.
No.
With Mao's entire reign.
You haven't got any evidence for that.
Well, what would you consider evidence? Would you consider Western scholars evidence, or what would you consider evidence? Chinese scholars?
It would depend on their background.
Would you accept a Chinese authority, a historian saying?
Possibly, but.
So we're talking about tens of millions at least. Would you agree? Tens of millions we're talking about.
Well, the lower tens of millions,
that's not excusable.
It's not, but it's nothing compared to the hundreds of millions, that perished under imperialism and
That's,
colonialism.
Wait, hang on. The figures are wrong.
And
it's not hundreds of millions, and that's whataboutism. That's what I'm saying. Tens of millions here.
It is whataboutism, because the whataboutism is pointed back at the people that.
But it's a fallacy. Whataboutism is a fallacy.
No, it's not. But that try and gain the moral high ground by trying to point out that millions of people died under a certain system.
But for someone to talk about the moral high ground with tens of millions dead, it's like a dead horse, but there's no point beating it.
And is to this day worse. So I always throw the whataboutism right in their face, right? But
you do realise it's a fallacy.
No, it's not a fallacy. It's not a fallacy.
Because you can't justify the deaths of tens of millions by saying other people did other stuff.
Christian Europeans, and in actual fact, and Arabs, as far as the sub-Saharan African, right? Arabs